We continue now at the top of Daf Lamed Dalet Amud Aleph Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 34a. On the previous Amud, the Gemara said, let's say you have a shomer chinam that's watching an item, and the item gets stolen from him, and instead of taking a shvu and exempting himself, he decides to pay for the item. So we say the shomer chinam is entitled to the kefel or the dalet v'hei, and the idea is that the owner essentially is makneh to him the kefel or the dalet v'hei in the event that he chooses to pay for the item in such a scenario. But Rami Bar Chama asks on the previous Amud, how can that kinyan work? That's a davar shelo bali olam. That kefil, that dalet v'hei, doesn't exist yet, and even if you say adam makna davar shelo bali olam, that's only something that we can assume is going to come into existence. But over here, mi yemer de mignav, over here, whoever says that this item that the shomer chinam is watching, who says it's going to get stolen? V'im timtzul amar de mignav, and if you're going to say that it is going to get stolen, mi yemer de mishtakach ganav, who says that the ganav will be found? V'im mishtakach ganav, and even if we find the ganav, mi yemer de mishalim, who says that he's going to end up paying the kefil? Dilma modi umifter, maybe he'll end up admitting and he'll exempt himself. And so therefore, this is something that we really can't depend on that it's going to exist. So how can we say that the person is makneh to the shomer chinam, or to whatever shomer it is? How can he be makneh the kefil to him? And the Gemara says, Amar Rava says, Nasa ka'omer lo l'keshetignav v'tirtza usashalmeini harei porasi kanu yolach me'achshav. What it actually, the way it works is as if he says to him that should the item get stolen and you decide to pay me, so then my cow is actually going to be acquired by you from now retroactively. When I'm giving you over this cow, you actually become the owner of this cow should all of these things happen. And then once he's the owner, of course he's entitled to the kefil or the dalet v'hei. And the Gemara continues, Maskef lo Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera asks on this, Ihachi, if so, afilu gizosel valdosel nami, even let's say it's shearings, or let's say it has offspring, the shomer should be entitled to that as well, because he's acquiring the cow retroactively. So if all these events unfold, that again, the animal gets stolen, and instead of taking a shvu, instead he pays, etc., if all of these events happen, so the condition is fulfilled, he now owns the cow retroactively, so he should be entitled to the shearings and the offspring. Aloma Tanya, why do we learn the Brisa, chutz min gizosel valdosel, that he acquires everything except for the shearings and the offspring? Elo Amar Rabbi Zera, rather Rabbi Zera says, Nasa komer lo, it's as if he says to him, it's as if the owner says to the shomer, chutz mi gizosel valdosel. He actually says to him, again, you're going to acquire the cow retroactively, but with the exception of the shearings and the offspring. The Gemara says, Umay Piska, but the Gemara says, well, why is that the case? Meaning, why would we just assume that he's giving it to him retroactively with this exception? And the Gemara says, Stama de milsa shivcha de asa me alma avid inish de makni. It makes sense in general that if you have some kind of improvement that's coming from the outside, that a person will give over. Meaning to say, like the kefil or the dalet v'hei, that's coming from the outside, so that he's willing to give to the shomer. But shivcha de miguva, but the improvement that comes from the animal itself, lo avid inish de makni, that a person is not going to give over, and so that exception makes sense. And the Gemara continues, Zika Diamri, there are those that say, Amar Rava says, Nasa ka'omer lo, it's as if he says to him, it's as if the owner says to the shomer, L'keshetignav v'tirtzu seshalmeini, when it gets stolen, and then you decide to pay me, Samuch lignevasa kanuyalach, near the time when it gets stolen, that's when you become the owner of the shore, meaning to say, or the animal, meaning to say, you become the owner of the animal the moment before it gets stolen, and so therefore the shearings and the offspring, that actually does not go to you, because you were not yet the owner at that time. The Gemara says, "My beinayu." Well, what's the difference between these approaches? Ika beinayu. The difference is kushya Rabbi Zera. Whether you have the question of Rabbi Zera, meaning to say you don't have the question of Rabbi Zera at all, if you're going to say that he only acquires the animal the moment before it gets stolen, because there's no reason you should assume at all that he's entitled to the shearings or the offspring. Inami, or another possible difference is the kaima ba'agam. Let's say at the time that it gets stolen, it's not stolen from his property, but it was out in the swamp and it gets stolen from there. So then, if you're going to say that the moment before it gets stolen, that's when he acquires it, he can't acquire it in this situation because it's not actually in his property the moment before it gets stolen. And Rashi says, Inami da'avekaima bi'agam, another difference could be if it's in the swamp, keshegon v'ganav, meaning when it gets stolen, it doesn't get stolen from the shomer's property, so then the kinyan is not going to work. Lelishna basra, according to the second version, lo konik feili, he's not going to be able to acquire the kefil, because at the time that it was stolen, right before it got stolen, it wasn't in his courtyard. Shetei chatzero konelo, that his chatzar, his courtyard, should be able to acquire it for him. Umashicha hishaita lo havoi v'may nikni, there was no mashicha at that moment. There's no way to acquire it. V'im tomar tikni lo mashicha rishon. Now, if you're going to ask, well, why can't the original mashicha that the shomer did, that should work as a kinyan? Shemosh chalo minas liknosa shah smucha liknevasa, and he's doing the mashicha on the condition to acquire it the moment before it gets stolen. So there was an act of mashicha, and Rashi says to that, Ha'amrinam b'chsubas, we say in ksubas ba'isha shenaflo lo nechasim ha'omer l'chaveru meshoch parzu. We say in ksubas that if somebody says to his friend, pull this cow, v'lo tikni loch ela lachar shloshim, but the kinyan is only going to take place after 30 days, lo kana. That actually does not work. That's not a good acquisition. So that is not going to work in this situation. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Shileim v'lo ratzah lishava v'chulu. If the shomer chooses to pay and he doesn't want to exempt himself by taking a shvua, so then he is entitled to the kefil and the dalid v'hei. And the Gemara says, Amar Reb Chia bar Abba, Amar Reb Yochanan. Reb Chia bar Abba says that Reb Yochanan says, Lo shileim mamish. It doesn't mean, when it says that he pays, it doesn't mean that he actually has to pay. Elakevan sha'amar hareini mishalim. Once he says, I am going to pay, afal bisha lo shileim. Even though he didn't actually pay yet, at that point in time, he becomes entitled to the kefil or the dalid v'hei. And the Gemara says, Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, Shilem v'lo ratzah lishav. It says he pays and he doesn't want to take the oath. So Shilem in, lo Shilem lo. It sounds like he has to actually pay. If he doesn't pay, that's not going to be sufficient. It's not sufficient simply to say that he's going to pay. But the Gemara says, Ema seva, but look at the end of the Mishnah. Nishba v'lo ratzah l'shalim. It says that if he takes an oath and doesn't want to pay. Time of the lo ratzah, it sounds like it's because he doesn't want to pay. Ha-ratzah, but if he does want to pay, afal bisha lo shilim, even though he hasn't yet paid, so still it's going to be sufficient, and he is going to be able to get the kefil and the dalid v'hei. And so the Gemara says, Ela meholak ela mashma mina. We really can't tell from the wording of the Mishnah because it goes in both directions. And the Gemara continues, Tanya Kavasi de Rabbi Yochanan. We have a brisa that supports Rabbi Yochanan that he doesn't actually have to pay. He just has to declare that he wants to pay. It says in the brisa, Hasocher par mechaver. If somebody rents a cow from his friend, v'nignava, and it is stolen, v'amar halo hareini mishalem v'eini nishba. And he says, I'm going to pay. I'm not going to take an oath. I'm not going to try to exempt myself with an oath. V'achar kach nimtza haganav, and then the ganav is found. Mishalem tashlum kefil hasocher. He pays that double payment to the socher, to the renter. And so you see over here that it is dependent on the fact that he says, I'm going to pay. It doesn't really matter that he actually pays. That's why this brisa supports Rabbi Yochanan. And the Gemara continues, Amar Papa says, Shomer Chinam, when it comes to Shomer Chinam. Kevan Shamar Pashati, once he says that I was negligent, essentially saying that he's obligated to pay, Makna le kefela, so then again he acquires the kefel, Di'iboy, Pater Nafshi B'gnei, because if he wanted to, he could have exempted himself by taking an oath and saying it was stolen, but he did not do that. Instead, he said he was negligent, he took responsibility, so then he gets the kefel. Shomer Sachar, when it comes to Shomer Sachar, similarly, Kevan Shamar Nigneva, once he says that it was stolen, and so he's essentially taking responsibility and he's saying he's going to pay, Makna le kefela, then he gets the kefel, Di'iboy, Pater Nafshi B'shavuro Mesa, because he could have exempted himself by saying that it broke a leg, by saying that it died, by saying some kind of accident happened. He did not do that. Instead, he said that he was chayiv and he said he was going to pay, and therefore, if they find the ganav, he's going to receive the kefel. And Shoel, when it comes to a borrower, Sha'omer Hareini Mishalim, where he says, I'm going to pay, so there lo makni like kefela. There the owner doesn't give over to him the kefel, because there was really no choice. The Shoel is responsible for everything. He's even responsible for an accident. But my havale lemifter nafshe, how could have he exempted himself? But Mesa machmas malacha, the only thing he might have been able to say is that it died because of the work that it was doing, essentially a natural death. But Mesa machmas malacha lo shriach, dying while it's doing its regular work is not common, and therefore he's not going to claim that. Therefore, there really wasn't anything practically he could have said to exempt himself, and that's why we say in that situation he doesn't get the kefil. But the Gemara continues, Ika Diamri, there are those that say, Amar Papa says, Shoel Nami, when it comes to a borrower as well. Kevan Shamar Hareini Mishalim, once he says that I'm going to pay, Machni like kefela, the owner does give him over the kefil. Di boy Pater Nafshi B'Meisa Machmas Malacha, because if he wanted, he could have exempted himself by saying that it died because of the work that it was doing. Again, a Shoel is borrowing the animal just for the purpose of doing the work. It's expected that he's going to use that animal for work, and therefore he does get out of paying if he says Mesa Machmas Malacha. So in the second version, since he could have said Mesa Machmas Malacha, despite the fact that maybe it's uncommon, but since he could have said Mesa Machmas Malacha, and he didn't, instead he said he's going to pay, so he does get the kefil. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Rev Zavid. Rev Zavid said to him, Hachi Amar Abaya, this is what Abaya says, Shoel ad sheyashalim. By a Shoel, it's not enough simply to say he's going to pay, he actually has to pay. My timer, what's the reason? Since he gets all the benefit, he's actually allowed to use the animal. He gets total benefit from the animal. B'dibura, with speech alone, just simply saying he's going to pay, that's not enough. Lo makni like kefela. For that, the owner is not going to give him the kefil. Tanya Kavasid Rev Zavid, the Gemara says we have a brisa that supports Rev Zavid. Hashoel par mechaver, we're talking about a borrower. A person borrows a cow from his friend, v'nignava, and it is stolen. V'kidem hashoel v'shile. And the shoel goes ahead and actually pays. It seems clear from the brisa that he actually has to pay the money. It's not enough to say he's going to pay the money, so he goes ahead and pays. And then the ganav is found. The kefil payment is paid to the shoel. And the Gemara says, Lelishna kama de Rav Papa. According to the first version of Rav Papa, Vadai lo havetiyufta. This brisa is certainly not a refutation of the first version of Rav Papa. But Lelishna basra leima tiavetiyufte. But according to the second version of Rav Papa, it seems like this brisa is actually a refutation of Rav Papa. And the Gemara says, not necessarily. Amar lach Rav Papa will say to you, you're trying to ask from this brisa, because what's the refutation? The possible refutation is this brisa seems to indicate that the shoel actually has to pay. And Rav Papa said in the second version of Rav Papa said that it is enough if he simply says he's going to pay. But Rav Papa will say to you, Mi alima mimas nisan, is that any better than the Mishnah? We asked a similar question from the Mishnah. The Katani Shilim, because the Mishnah says that he paid. V'yukimna ba'amar, and we've said before that it could mean to say that he said he was going to pay. It doesn't actually mean he paid. So hachanami, so here also ba'amar, maybe the brisa just means that the shoel says he's going to pay. It doesn't necessarily mean that he actually pays. But the Gemara says, "Mi dami, can you really compare the language of the brisa to the language of the Mishnah? Hasam lo katani kidem, over there in the Mishnah it doesn't say the word kidem. Kidem indicates that he actually pays. He goes ahead and he advances the money, so to speak. But over here, katani kidem, it says kidem, that sounds like he's doing something. He's actually paying the money. The Gemara says, not necessarily. My kidem, what is the word kidem? It could be kidem v'amar. It could mean he gets up and he says he's going to pay, but it doesn't actually mean that he's going to pay. But the Gemara continues, but from the fact that by the socher, by the renter, the brisa that talked about a renter, it says over there v'yamar, it says that he says he's going to pay. V'gabe shoel kidem, and by the borrower it uses the word kidem, shmami no davka katani. Doesn't that indicate that by the shoel it's more than just saying, because it's using a different language, it sounds like he's actually paying. Gemara says, well, that's not necessarily true. Midi gabe hadadi tanya, are these two brisas learned by each other that you can compare the language and say, since the language is slightly different by the shoel brisa, therefore it means he's actually going to pay? These brisas were learned independently, so the fact that they chose slightly different language doesn't prove anything. And the Gemara continues, Shailinu letanoi devei Rabbi Chia udvei Rav Oshia. They asked the Tanoim, those who learned the brisas by the yeshiva of Rabbi Chia and the yeshiva of Rav Oshia, v'amri, and they said actually gabe hadadi tanya, and the two brisas were learned together, and therefore you can learn something out from the change in the language. And Rashi explains, Lelishna kama de Rav Papa vade lo havetiyufta. According to the first version of Rav Papa, the brisa is certainly not a refutation. The first version of Rav Papa was that if a shoel says he's going to pay, that is not enough to get him the kefil, because he couldn't have exempted himself anyway, because Mesa Machamas Malacha is considered to be uncommon. And Rashi explains, the name of Kevin the time of the Rav Papa mishum de lo hava lemifter navshe da Mesa Machamas Malacha lo shricha. You might have said that since Rav Papa says that exempting oneself with Mesa Machamas Malacha doesn't really count because it's not common, so you might have extended that logic and said, Afilu kidem v'shilem nami is leila Rav Papa de lo kani like feila. Even if the person actually paid, not just said he was going to pay, but even if the shoel actually paid, according to Rav Papa, he wouldn't get the kefil. Now, if you said that that's what Rav Papa meant in the first version, then there would be a question from this brisa. Particularly, then it would be a question from this brisa, because the brisa says that that is not the case. The brisa says that if the shoel goes ahead and pays, that he is going to be able to get the kefil, but that's not true, says Rashi. Havade lekala osve, you can't ask on Rav Papa. Because Rav Papa could simply respond within the first version, I just said that if the shoel says he's going to pay, he doesn't get the kefil. I didn't say that even though he pays, meaning it could be that in the first version of Rav Papa, it's only when the shoel says he's going to pay that that's not enough to get the kefil, but it could be in that first version, if the shoel actually pays, that is enough to get the kefil, and that's exactly what the brisa said. So the first version of Rav Papa could be consistent with the brisa, but the second version of Rav Papa said that if he says he's going to pay, it is enough to get the kefil, and then that might be a tiyufta, name a tiyufta. Maybe the brisa contradicts Rav Papa, because the brisa seems to say that he actually has to pay. It's not enough just to say you're going to pay. Mi name a deshilem davka kamartan the brisa. Are we going to say that he actually has to pay according to the brisa? And then the Gemara went back and forth on that issue, whether the brisa is saying he actually has to pay, or whether saying he's going to pay is good enough. And Rashi continues, since by the brisa that talked about a socher, it says that he says he's going to pay. Like we said earlier, Tanya Kavasi de Rabbi Yochanan in the brisa, like Rabbi Yochanan v'gabe shoel v'kidem v'shilem, and by the shoel it says that it seems like he actually paid. Bahach the Tanya Kavasi de Rav Zvid in this brisa that's supporting Rav Zvid. And then the Gemara said that you can't necessarily tell from comparing the language of the two brisas, because we don't know if those brisas were taught together. And it says Shailinu b'nei hayeshiva letanoi sheyushonen tosefta de Rabbi Chia v'tosefta de Rabbi Yoshi. The Talmidim, the b'nei yeshiva, asked those Tanoim who taught the toseftas of Rabbi Chia and the Toseftas of Rabbi Yoshia, Shehem Iker, those are the main Toseftas. Kedamrin and Balma, we say that in general. Kol Masnisa de lo Misna be Rabbi Yoshia, Rabbi Chia, any Brisa that wasn't taught by Rabbi Yoshia, Rabbi Chia, Lo Tosvu be Midrasha, don't bring that as a question in the Beis Medrash. And so they asked them, were these taught together? And they said, yes, indeed, they were taught together, and therefore you can make an inference from the change in the language. And the Gemara continues, Pshita, it is obvious. Amar Eini Mishalim. If at first the Shomer says, I'm not going to pay. V'chazur v'yamar Hareini Mishalim, and then he says, no, I will pay. Hakamar Hareini Mishalim. He is saying he's going to pay, and so therefore he should be entitled to the kefil. Elo Amar Hareini Mishalim. But what about if he says, I am going to pay? And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Lamed Dalid Amid Beis.